Now, the other day I went to see Godzilla Minus One, expecting little more than a fun, action-packed monster or kaiju movie. And sure, beforehand I'd heard that there were some really good reviews out there for it. None I'd personally read or watched, because I tend to purposely avoid reviews for things I know I already want to see or have decided to see, mainly to not set my expectations one way or the other. Anyway, as I was saying, I'd still kind of heard through the proverbial grapevine that it was actually supposed to be a pretty dang good movie, but I didn't know the reasons why that I had avoided. And so I figured perhaps they'd somehow managed to do something rather unique and different with the titular giant lizard known as Godzilla. Something different than what had been done dozens upon dozens of times before over the past 70 years now with him, or other monsters like him, where they're usually, attacking cities or fighting against other giant monsters. And so I thought, I don't know, maybe it wasn't going to be something quite that simple this time around, that it would instead somehow be kind of a interesting take on his story, perhaps, on Godzilla's story, that again would basically lead to something that would, more or less keep me thoroughly entertained over the course of 2 hours, mainly because of giant monster action. But it turns out that they really didn't do anything all that unique with Godzilla, the monster himself. In fact, in that respect, it was pretty generic. As is often the case, he was just there soaking up radiation and coming ashore to wreak havoc, and to knock over or blow some buildings up in Tokyo because that's kind of what he does, or because the humans were pissing him off or something. However, what I didn't expect, especially after watching, and for the most part enjoying for the spectacle, all the more recent big-budget Godzilla movies Hollywood has been cranking out over the past decade or so in the Monsterverse, movies where the human characters all too often feel like some kind of boring subplot at the very best, there because you need some kind of context for what the monsters are doing. Well, I didn't expect this new Godzilla movie to honestly not have a ton of Godzilla in it. Sure, he's there enough, and when he is, he makes the best usage of his time. He is truly terrifying in this, don't get me wrong. He is the main attraction, if you will. But he's not there a lot, and you're not exactly missing him when he's gone, because it turns out this was one of the best, human movies or explorations of humanity I've seen in a long while. And yeah, you heard me right. A Godzilla movie was fantastic because of the humans, not because of the monster, or not necessarily because of the monster. As I was just saying, he was absolutely done right in this. Sometimes a bit less of something turns out to be more, and I think that was true in this case. And without going into spoiler territory, because if you haven't seen this film yet, and even if you generally don't think of yourself as a fan of this type of movie, you should absolutely check it out when you get the chance. But rarely do movies of any kind, even when they don't feature giant monsters or anything of the sort, but rarely do they truly make you feel so many emotions and make you genuinely feel for the characters or feel for their plight. Everything from guilt, hope, vengeance, and love is explored beautifully in this film, which is presented in this very bleak setting of a post-World War II Japan. It is honestly one of the most real films I've seen again in a good long while. And what this film accomplishes is maybe even more impressive in some ways, considering it's subtitled, and what oftentimes has to sell it, assuming you don't speak Japanese, of course, are just the raw performances by the actors, no doubt brought forth by a skilled director, that being Takashi Yamazaki in this case, who, not long ago, I recalled while watching this, said he wanted to direct a Star Wars movie, and he credited Star Wars as being what inspired him to become a filmmaker in the first place. And at this point, after seeing this incredible film, and for what it's worth, he gets my stamp of approval. I would love to see what he could do with Star Wars after seeing what he did with Godzilla on such a limited budget. In fact, one of the first things I did after walking out of the theater was look up just how much this movie cost, and it turned out to be $15 million, which is only roughly a tenth at most of what a lot of the big-budgeted, special effects bloated Hollywood films these days are. For example, the budget on Godzilla vs. Kong was somewhere between $155 and $200 million. And though, sure, you can argue it looked awesome, that it was a visual spectacle or feast, and as I said before, I, for the most part, enjoy them because there's just something about giant monsters wrestling or fighting in a city that appeals to my primal brain, but it certainly didn't have the heart and soul this movie did, not even close. In fact, like I was saying before, the human characters in those big-budgeted Monsterverse films just felt there for context's sake. You never really care about their stories or what happens to them, and when they linger on screen a bit too long, you start to hope the monster will show up and put an end to them. But in -1, you truly dread the return of Godzilla and what that return might mean for these characters you're really caring about. Another thing then this all made me wonder when I saw how relatively cheap this movie was to make was how much something like Rebel Moon cost, because speaking of Star Wars before, Rebel Moon was of course originally pitched to Lucasfilm to be a Star Wars movie, and is also clearly inspired by Star Wars, or inspired by some of the things that inspired Star Wars, or inspired George Lucas. But it's kind of the opposite of this new Godzilla film in so many ways. Rebel Moon, which cost around $166 million for the record, is perhaps one of the least human movies I've seen in a while. It's far more about the action and the spectacle than anything else. It's all about the special effects, not letting the characters truly drive and be the heart of an amazing story that just so happens to be set in this fantastical other galaxy, which is one of the main reasons why Star Wars or A New Hope worked so well, why it was such a massive success. Yes, it had special effects unlike anything that had been seen before at the time, but if there weren't real characters in there that you cared about, and of course an actual solid story, we certainly wouldn't be talking about Star Wars today, not in the same way at least. We might talk about how its effects started to change the industry, but not about the cultural impact it had because of the characters that have become icons. And none of this is to say or imply Godzilla -1 wasn't also a spectacle in its own right, or that it didn't look great. It just wasn't the point of the movie to be a spectacle, just like it wasn't the point of Star Wars, once upon a time, to just be a spectacle, and hence it's still beloved today for being much more than that. And I mean, personally, I thought -1 looked great, or even perfect in some ways, because it never tried to go too over the top with anything it did in the special effects department. You never, shall we say, noticed the special effects for better or worse. They were neither so intrusively grandiose that you rolled your eyes, or so poorly done that they stuck out like a sore thumb and made you cringe. You could say this film used special effects more like a tool to tell a story, like George Lucas once talked about.
Special effects are just a tool, a means of telling a story. People have a tendency to confuse them as an end to themselves. A special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing.
And that truly is one of the biggest problems with films today, I feel. They, in essence, use special effects like some sort of crutch. They expect them to be the movie, or what makes the movie, or to make up for something else that the movie or its story is lacking. You're supposed to enjoy the surface-level spectacle and not care that there's very little substance underneath it all. And though sure, you can enjoy a movie for whatever reason you want, enjoyment is subjective, you can love something that is essentially just a big dumb piece of fun if you want to, that's fine. There's plenty of movies I have enjoyed over the years that are nothing more than spectacles. But either way, and in all reality here, special effects aren't all that special anymore. There's not a whole lot that hasn't already been done with them or that hasn't been seen from them. I don't know that we're not all that close to the ceiling already, or that there's a lot of room for them to get better. And in all reality, as I've seen some argue, special effects have actually maybe been getting worse in recent years, or just look lazy in comparison to what's been done before. The effort that goes into creating them is not what it once was, or they're just sort of taken for granted, you could say. I mean, you can't tell me that anything has come along in the last decade or so, or since something like the first Avatar came out 15 years ago, that has truly wowed you in the special effects department, short of maybe the second Avatar film. And honestly, I can't help but chuckle, or maybe feel sad because I love going to the movies, every time I hear about how rough things are going for Hollywood or the movie industry these days. That so many movies lose money and the industry is struggling, and may eventually die, because they don't make enough money, because movies cost too much money, even though I just watched an exceptional movie that cost only $15 million. But their answer seems to be to rely even more so on nostalgia, and then going even bigger with it in the process, to recycle the old but to put even more money into it at the same time, because surely that'll work this time around. And yet, here was Godzilla, the longest running film franchise in history, 38 movies and counting, coming from a genre that you could argue kind of started the idea that film should go big or go home. And what it did was, crazy enough, it went smaller and focused on being a great story driven by believable and memorable characters, one that just so happened to also be about a giant lizard who likes to attack cities. Well, that's all I got for this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me if you've seen Godzilla -1 and what you thought of it, or tell me what you think about special effects these days. Are they special or not so much anymore? and if the over-reliance on them is becoming like a crutch that will eventually give out and maybe do detrimental damage to the industry. Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Godzilla. And until next time, thanks for watching.